In the dim corridors of the palace, shadows moved like secrets, concealing the hurried exchange of small parcels and whispered instructions. Among them was a small, unmarked package of dried duskroot, its journey through hidden hands finally bringing it to the palace kitchens. There, it was crushed, boiled, and brewed into a dark, ominous liquid. As evening fell, a servant hurried through the grand halls, his hand steady as he held the cup containing the brewed duskroot. The servant pushed open the doors to the palace hall, nodding reverently, offering the cup with both hands. But just as the king's frail hands reached for the cup, a voice cut through the quiet.
Wait.
Arden, ever watchful and always at the king's side, stepped forward, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He took the cup from the king's trembling hands, holding it up to the light. The dark liquid within seemed to swirl, opaque and unsettling. Without a word, Arden drew a slim silver pin from his cloak and dipped it into the drink. All eyes watched as he withdrew it. A collective breath held as he examined it. Slowly, the bright silver turned black, the tarnish spreading like ink over the metal. Arden's face darkened, his eyes flashing with restrained anger. He turned to the servant.
Where did you get this?
He demanded, his voice cold and laced with accusation. The servant trembled, his gaze darting to the floor as beads of sweat formed on his brow.
The kitchen, sir.
It was prepared there, just as ordered.
By who?
Arden's tone sharpened, leaving no room for evasion. The servant stammered, his words spilling out in a panic.
I don't know. The herb was delivered and we were told it was essential for the king's recovery. I only followed orders, sir.
Arden's grip tightened around the cup, his mind racing. He had intercepted this attempt just in time, but the question lingered. Who would dare to poison the king under the guise of a cure? He ordered the servant to check the ingredients of the concoction immediately. The early dawn crept through the towering trees as Captain Rylan and Lyra rode silently. The soft thud of their horses' hooves, the only sound breaking the morning stillness. They had no choice but to accept this endeavor. The real challenge wasn't the journey beyond the city. It was enduring each other's presence. They were a stark contrast to each other. A warrior bred for battle and a healer driven to restore life. Neither spoke, though each could feel the weight of the other's presence. Rylan's gaze stayed fixed on the path ahead, alert and unyielding. Their destination lay just beyond the city's outskirts, nestled in the thick of the forest where rare herbs grew. The sun had climbed high when they finally reached the grove, a secluded clearing where the plants Lyra needed flourished. Lyra dismounted and set about her task, her fingers delicate and precise as she carefully plucked leaves and roots, muttering their names under her breath. Rylan watched her from a short distance, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his senses as vigilant as always. But just as Lyra leaned down to gather another sprig of the herb, a rustle in the bushes nearby sent a ripple through the stillness. Rylan was on guard in an instant, his sword drawn in a swift, practiced motion, his gaze locked on the source of the sound. From the undergrowth, a small creature emerged, and Lyra's eyes widened as she caught sight of it. A scruffy gray cat, blinking lazily in the sunlight, its tail flicking with unbothered indifference. A soft giggle escaped Lyra's lips.
Not everything is the enemy, Captain,
She said, her eyes bright with amusement. Rylan paused, lowering his sword and releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For a moment, he felt the corners of his mouth twitch, a faint smile barely there. He glanced sideways, sheathing his sword as the cat slinked away into the underbrush. They returned to their task, but the air between them felt lighter, as if the small exchange had loosened the invisible chain of tension. As Lyra knelt, sorting through herbs with practiced hands, she asked, her voice calm yet firm.
Captain, why are enemy soldiers treated so harshly, even after they're captured and no longer a threat?
Rylan's expression hardened, his gaze narrowing as he considered her words.
They are our enemies.
He replied, his tone unyielding.
If they had won, they'd show no mercy to our men. It's the nature of war.
Lyra paused, holding a leaf between her fingers.
Is it really war, though, if you're fighting men who can't fight back?
Rylan shifted uncomfortably, surprised by her directness.
They are threats. Given the chance, they'd use any kindness against us.
But compassion isn't weakness, Captain.
She replied softly.
It's strength. They're human, too. And by treating them differently, we lose a part of ourselves.
Rylan fell silent, her words digging deeper than he expected. He wanted to argue, to tell her that she couldn't understand the burdens he carried, the lives that depended on him. But something in her quiet conviction gave him pause. He was a soldier, trained to protect his people. Yet here was Lyra, a healer, who risked herself to help anyone in need, regardless of which side they were on.
Sometimes being a soldier means doing things you hate, for the greater good.
He said after a moment, voice low. She looked up, her gaze unwavering.
Maybe it's not just the battle outside you need to win. Perhaps the one within, too. Don't you think?
Rylan felt a pang of unease, as if her words struck something raw and unhealed within him. He looked away, taking a deep breath, feeling both challenged and, oddly, at peace. Lyra continued gathering the herbs, her hands gentle as she handled each leaf with care. Rylan watched her, curiosity breaking through his guarded expression.
You seem to have quite a few thoughts on the art of war for a healer,
He said, half amused, half cautious. She looked up, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze.
Maybe because I'd rather see fewer lives lost. Every life spared is a victory in itself.
Rylan crossed his arms, pondering.
In my world, winning means securing peace, even if that means fighting to the last. War is a necessary evil when there's no other way.
What if you could win a battle before it even begins?
He raised an eyebrow.
You mean negotiation?
Not just that.
She replied, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear as she picked another sprig of herb.
Strategic planning. Understanding your enemy. Knowing what they value most. If you can find their reason to fight, maybe you can find a way to disarm them before swords are even drawn.
Rylan considered this, a crease forming on his brow.
You make it sound easy. Wars are usually more about territory, pride, or revenge. Those aren't things easily put aside.
She nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words.
But if commanders on both sides understood the true costs of battle, the scars it leaves on people, on families, wouldn't they see the value in a smaller victory if it meant fewer lives lost?
Rylan's gaze softened slightly, though he tried to maintain his hardened stance.
You speak like someone who hasn't seen the battlefield, Lyra. In the heat of war, ideals fall apart, replaced by raw survival.
Lyra held his gaze, undeterred.
And yet, someone has to hold on to those ideals, or the world will only ever know bloodshed.
Rylan looked away, grappling with the weight of her words. His role had always been clear. Fight, defend, protect, at any cost. But Lyra's perspective made him wonder if his duty could be carried out with more than just brute strength.
Perhaps you're right.
He said at last, voice barely audible. Seeing a shift in his steely resolve, however slight, she said,
Wars are fought by humans, Captain. If we treat them as such, maybe we'll find the battles worth fighting, and those that aren't.
Rylan swallowed, her words sinking deeper than he cared to admit. She had a point, one he couldn't ignore no matter how much he wanted to. He'd been raised to see the world in absolutes. Loyalty, duty, and strength. But Lyra's compassion was a mirror to his own internal conflict, one he'd never had the courage to confront. The silence stretched on between them, and this time, it wasn't tense or uneasy. It was reflective, each lost in their own thoughts as they gathered the herbs. Side by side, but worlds apart. Rylan found himself watching her, noticing how carefully she tended to each plant, as if even these herbs were living things deserving of respect. In that moment, he felt a strange sensation, a quiet admiration for the healer beside him, for her strength to follow her path, even if it meant standing against the values he held so dear. When they finally mounted their horses to return, the journey felt different, though neither spoke of it. A glimmer of understanding neither had anticipated. The city walls loomed in the distance. The ride back was still silent, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. The sun had barely dipped below the city walls when Captain Rylan and Lyra finally made their way back to the Apothecary, a satchel of rare herbs secured tightly to Ryland's side. Relief washed over Lyra as the familiar sight of Master Rorik's humble shop came into view, only to be replaced by tension the moment they stepped inside. Seated with an air of superiority was Arden, lounging with unsettling ease amidst the apothecary's shelves, his guards stationed like statues by his side. Ryland's expression darkened as Arden rose, a thin smirk playing at his lips. The captain's distaste was palpable. There was nothing he hated more than seeing Arden's smug face.
What's going on?
Ryland demanded, his voice edged with restrained irritation. Master Rorik's weary sigh filled the silence as he shook his head, glancing away. Arden turned to Master Rorik with a mocking glint in his eye.
Well, Master Rorik, would you like to handle the situation, or should I?
Master Rorik nodded solemnly.
It is your jurisdiction, Arden. I won't interfere.
With a cold tone, Arden turned to Ryland and Lyra.
There was an attack on the king's life, while you were off on your little rendezvous.
Ryland clenched his jaw, every muscle coiled to keep his rage in check. But Arden pressed on, his voice as sharp as a blade.
Upon investigation, all evidence leads here to this apothecary. Specifically to a certain herb that arrived in the palace last night, duskroot.
His gaze shifted to Lyra, whose face had gone pale, a look of shock and disbelief flickering across her features.
Were you not the one who provided the duskroot last evening?
His words sliced through the tension, and everyone's eyes turned to her. The silence was suffocating. Ryland, Master Rorik, and Arden all waited. At last, Lyra managed a nod, her voice barely a whisper.
Yes, I did, but
That makes her a prime suspect in an attempted assassination of the king.
Arden's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, and he cast a mocking glance at Ryland as if daring him to argue. Ryland's patience had worn thin.
This proves nothing.
He countered, stepping protectively between Lyra and the guards.
Many people buy herbs here. This is no evidence Lyra had a motive.
Arden's smile widened, though there was no warmth in it.
Precisely why? She's being arrested. We'll investigate further.
He sneered, stepping forward with an air of smug authority. Ryland blocked his path, glaring with fury. Arden's expression remained impassive as he stepped closer, speaking in a whisper meant only for Ryland.
You have authority outside the city. But here, my word is the law. So step aside.
As the guards advanced to restrain Lyra, Ryland grabbed Arden's arm, eyes full of rage staring at him. Arden said with a chilling smile, a mockery of concern in his voice.
Don't worry.
Releasing his arm from Ryland's grip with a jolt.
I will take very good care of her.